Hello Year 10. So this lesson marks the final poem in the anthology. So if you've been following all of my YouTube videos, then after today's lesson, you will have covered all of the poems in the anthology. Now, this is assuming that you've done the ones that we did in school before lockdown, but certainly since lockdown, I've now done a video for each of the poems that we hadn't already studied. If there are some of the poems that you have missed because you were absent when we were in school, and you'd like me to do a lesson for any of the other poems in the anthology, please email me and I'll be happy to do one for you. So today we're looking at As Imperceptibly as Grief, which is definitely one of the trickier poems in the anthology. It's one of the reasons why we've left it to last. So as always, we're going to start by thinking about some vocabulary. So an old word that we're going to retrieve is disillusioned. So I'd like you to spend a moment and think about what we mean by disillusioned. If someone is feeling disillusioned, how are they feeling? So if you're disillusioned, then something you previously thought or something you previously believed is not what you expected. So let's imagine you've been really excited and you're going to a party at a friend's house, and you've really built it up in your mind and you thought it was going to be really amazing. And actually it was a bit of a letdown for lots of different reasons. You might then feel disillusioned. So our question then, linking back to Afternoons, the poem we did last week, why are the mothers disillusioned in Afternoons? Why or how is he presenting those mothers as disillusioned? Do you think adult life and motherhood is maybe what they were expecting? You can pause the video, have a go at answering that question. So the mothers are presented as disillusioned because what Larkin does is he creates a very negative portrayal of what being a mum is like. He describes it as thickening their beauty, so it is almost aging and changing their bodies. It's sort of sucking away all their youth and attractiveness. He describes domestic life as almost being like a prison. You know, they're trapped in these flats with an estate full of washing. You know, their relationships aren't what they used to be, and they sort of are taken for granted by their husbands and by their children. And generally, you know, when you're young, you look forward to being an adult and the freedoms that you have, but actually motherhood is a cage, motherhood is a restriction. So rather than being free, they are in fact the opposite. And I made my views on the poem quite clear in our last lesson, but he's certainly presenting these mothers as being very disillusioned in what adult life is really, really like. So our new word then is imperceptible, which is obviously from the title of the poem. So it's very important that we understand what that means. So if something is imperceptible, it's so slight, gradual or subtle that you don't perceive it, you don't notice it. So if something's imperceptible, you barely notice it's happening. So an example might be his head moved in an almost imperceptible nod. That means that that person's nodded, but it's so brief or such a small movement that you barely notice it. So the best way of thinking about imperceptible is something that you barely notice. Okay. And we can see As Imperceptibly as Grief is a simile, or it's the start of a simile to talk about the grieving process being something that's very imperceptible, something very gradual and subtle that you barely notice. So thinking back to Afternoons then, in Afternoons, how is the change in the mothers imperceptible? So how is this change from sort of youth, adolescence to motherhood, and this sort of negative change in their life? How does Larkin present that as something almost imperceptible? So again, you can pause the video and have a think or jot down an answer to that question. So what Larkin does in Afternoons is he is very subtle in describing what the situation is for the mothers. It's very heavily implied that their life is now negative. He doesn't come right out and say it. So that in itself, that negativity is imperceptible. But it seems like phrases, they are being pushed to the side of their own lives, is very imperceptible. It's showing us that they don't quite understand how they got into that situation, why their lives are so difficult now. And, you know, that marriage and, you know, becoming that wife. And remember, this is the 1960s when gender roles were very set in stone. The women did predominantly stay at home and do all the domestic tasks. That change from, you know, free youth to wife and then to mother is a very imperceptible one, because they didn't know what it was really going to be like. They thought it would be all grown up and special, but Larkin is certainly presenting it as the opposite. But it's a change, the passing of time, this change that is a very imperceptible one. So another word I'd just like you to jot down, just because it pops up in the poem, is sequestered. Now, if something is sequestered or someone is sequestered, it's a place isolated and hidden away. So if you could just jot down that word, sequestered, that adjective and the definition. You can just pause the video while you do that. Okay, so today we're going to analyse the theme of the passing of time in As Imperceptibly as Grief by Emily Dickinson. So we can see that we're picking up on the same theme, the passing of time in Afternoons. Equally to Autumn, which we also talked about last week, by John Keats, where he uses the seasons to reflect on the cycle of life and death. These three poems, To Autumn, Afternoons, and As Imperceptibly as Grief, are using the seasons and the passing of time to do something quite similar, which is why we've studied Afternoons and As Imperceptibly as Grief together. So by the end of the lesson, as usual, you'll know the context of the poem, so we know that we have to write about the context in the exam. How Dickinson uses language to explore themes such as the passing of time, death and loss, and change and transformation, and the effect of Dickinson's use of language. So we're going to have a little bit of a think about the context then. So Emily Dickinson was an American poet in the 19th century. And we know that in the 19th century, again, we're talking about the same century as A Christmas Carol, for example. We're talking about the same century as a lot of the Romantic poets. But Emily Dickinson was an American poet. She was obsessed with and afraid of death. And this is really important link into the poem. And this is because one of her childhood friends died when she was 13. And then between the age of 10 and 25, her bedroom overlooked a graveyard where 5 of her friends were also buried. Now, obviously, we know that in the 19th century and then in centuries before, medicine, surgery, all of those sorts of things were very rudimentary. People didn't really have proper medicine, proper care by a doctor, and as a result, lots of people tragically died, particularly children and young people. So it wasn't unusual to lose friends, but for Emily Dickinson, she found that incredibly traumatic. And it's an experience that made her terrified of death, but also obsessed with ideas about death at the same time. Remember, if you are noting this down, you can pause the video at any time to jot some of this down. But again, don't feel like you have to just copy it out. You write what you think is important. So she was a prolific writer of letters. Now, prolific means it's one of the things that she eventually became famous for. She found the writing of letters as a way of avoiding social calls. Now, and as we're going to talk about in a minute, Emily Dickinson didn't really like physically being with people. She had lots of friends, but she kept those friendships with letters. So think about nowadays the sorts of people who you know, particularly as you get maybe older and into an adult, there are some people that you really only speak with now via social media because they live in another country or they live quite far away and it's difficult to physically see them. So think about her a bit like that. She didn't really see her friends in person, but she did communicate with them a lot via letters. In her letters, that's where she developed and honed her sort of skills and her flair for writing. So she was a recluse and maintained friendships through letters. So she didn't like to leave her house. She liked to keep to herself. She didn't like that sort of physical socializing with people. And that's what we mean by a recluse. She stayed predominantly inside. Now, one of the reasons for this is because she cared for her sick mother for almost 30 years. And her mother insisted that someone be with her constantly, that she was never left alone. And this fell really to Emily Dickinson. So she was a recluse by choice, but that wasn't helped by the fact that she had to almost constantly be with and care for her mother. So again, her mother was someone who was very ill and sick throughout that whole time. So we can understand with that, paired with the fact that her bedroom window used to overlook a graveyard where her friends were buried who she lost young, we can begin to build up a picture about why this person was sort of obsessed with ideas about death, because it doesn't sound like she lived a particularly joyful life. Most of her poems were published after her death, which means they're very personal. She didn't write poetry because she deliberately intended to publish them for everyone to read. So they're a lot more private. And it wasn't till after her death that most of them were published. So her poetry is almost for herself, really, as opposed to for anyone else. A little bit like Sonnet 43, if you can remember that when we were studying Romeo and Juliet. How do I love thee, let me count the ways. Elizabeth Browning was writing the poem to her fiance, who her father didn't approve of. And remember, we talked about how that was very personal because she didn't intend for anyone other than him to read it. So Emily Dickinson's poetry is similar in that it wasn't intended originally for publication. So it is more her personal thoughts. So she was interested in all sorts of things, and we need to remember that in the 19th century, because of things like the Industrial Revolution and then better understandings of science, anatomy, technology, machinery, space, you know, the 19th century was really a time where almost the modern world was born. And as a result, there were all sorts of interesting things, new concepts and science for people to become interested in. And Emily Dickinson was interested in these things. So astronomy, which is the study of space, botany, the study of plants, geology, the study of sort of rocks and the earth, natural history, and maths. These were all things that she was interested in. So even though she stayed inside, she was an educated and intelligent woman that had sort of interest in all of these things about the physical way the world works. And as well as chemistry as well. And again, chemistry was something that was really being born in the 19th century, and people had a much more developed idea about what science was. She was also interested in something called transcendentalism, which we're not going to talk on massive about now because it's something very complicated. But it's this idea that actually people can obtain and gain knowledge through invention and imagination. You know, it doesn't have to be about being in a formal education. It's almost like through inventing, through being imaginative and creative, we can learn so much about the way the world works. And equally, she felt that studying the natural world, and again, the science behind the way the world functioned, was a way to witness the divine. And by divine, we mean God. God is revealed in how the world is structured and balanced impeccably or perfectly. So she is someone who, whilst was a Christian in the sense that everyone was really Christian in their society, She believed that you better understood God through the study of the world and science. So she was quite forward thinking, because a lot of people were very afraid of science. They believed that science was the opposite or the antithesis to God. So a lot of people really looked down on science and thought it was trying to sort of destroy God and Christianity, which of course it wasn't. But a lot of science then counteracted what was in the Bible. But Emily Dickinson believed that it was through science and through understanding the way the world worked that you could then sort of witness the sort of wonder of God's creation. So it's quite a lot of context there. I appreciate that. And again, you might not choose to write it all down, but this isn't an easy poem, but it becomes easier when you understand some of the things that Emily Dickinson was interested in, particularly as she's just writing this poem for herself, really, not for anybody else. So what can we expect from her poems then? Generally open-ended or unanswered questions. She might pose questions, but she doesn't have the answers. It's almost as rhetorical questions that we're having to sort of think about the answer. Generally, her poetry is quite negative. She tends to concentrate on some negative emotions, but also, you know, likes to contrast and compare things. She also likes to focus on aphorism, which is this idea of observations containing a general truth. So a lot of her poetry, like Afternoons, is about what she's observing. Sitting in her house, what is she observing out of her window? And she felt through observing the natural world and observing nature, she'd gain the truth about life and the truth about existence. So these are some really big sort of philosophical ideas that Emily Dickinson was thinking about. And that's, again, another reason why this poem can be a little bit tricky, because those big ideas that she's exploring can be quite complicated for us to get our heads around. So we're going to annotate the poem now, and I'm going to switch to the visualizer as usual, but we're going to be thinking about some of the themes that she focuses on. So we've got, again, the passing of time. We've got decay and decline, you know, death, this idea of loneliness and emptiness, the cyclical nature of life. So the way that life goes in circles, again, like the seasons, the nature of loss and grief, again, something she experienced a lot of, but also memory. And these are all ideas that she focuses on in the poem. Right, well, the good news is that it's a nice little poem. So although it's difficult, it is short. So as always, and whether this is an unseen poem or whether this is an anthology poem, the title is always worth analysing and giving information for. So what we have here is we have the title is foreshadowing the theme of death. So again, thinking about those themes, death and loss is one that we said was prevalent in this poem, and that's what the title is doing through the word grief. So let's look at this first line then, or first couple of lines. As imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away. So what we have here is we have a simile. Remember, a simile is when two things are compared using like or as. So what Dickinson is saying here is that as subtly as the grieving process, summer ends. And then of course we're looking at autumn starts. So we can see this idea of the seasons, just like in Afternoons and just like to autumn as well. And we can see that it is the same season, this end of summer beginning of autumn, which we see in the first stanza of To Autumn. We also see this same time of year in Afternoons as well. So it's obviously a time of year which is really the beginnings of decay, the beginnings of old age, the beginnings of thinking about looking towards death, because obviously winter is our season that symbolises death, as we've spoken about in previous videos. It's also interesting to consider that she's got this simile the wrong way round. Normally the bit that's being compared, or the symbolism, comes second, but instead she's started with this idea of grief. And with this idea of grief, we can think about the context. We know she was scared / obsessed with death. So she's presenting grief really as something very important to the poem. It's also interesting to consider that by comparing grief to summer, or linking these two ideas, she's saying that grief, or the feeling of grief, is inevitable because summer comes around every year. And again, we're looking at this idea of cycles or circles again. So again, linking to the context, someone who experienced a lot of grief, for her, you may feel grief one time, but then actually that grieving process will come back as you lose someone else. So she's thinking of this idea of grief will always come back, just like summer. So again, it's a very sort of depressing opening, this idea that grief is so it's a bit blurry, grief is so natural and so common that it will always come back. What's also very unusual in this poem is the way she likes to capitalise these nouns, these things, these concepts. So we've got grief here, and summer, and then perfidy, and then we see quietness, twilight, nature, sequestered, afternoon, dusk, morning, grace, guest, wing, keel, summer, beautiful. So we can see that all the way through she has capitalised these nouns. Now it's almost, you could say, just trying to think where best to write this. So this capitalisation of the nouns is almost personification. Remember, personification is when we are giving human characteristics to things, to objects. It could suggest she was so lonely, because remember, she was a recluse, that she viewed concepts or ideas like people. It's just an interesting thing to consider, because it's very unusual focusing, using all of these what appears random capital letters, but of course they're not random. These are the important ideas or concepts she's wanting us to think about. What we also see in the poem is all of these dashes. We can see we've got one here and one here, and in terms of form and structure they continue. Now what we could say here is that the dashes represent her fragmented or tormented, maybe even mentally unstable mind. It's like she can't concentrate on one concept or one thought, and these dashes make the poem very broken up. It's very slow, it slows it right down, but it also breaks it up into these little snippets or little fragments, almost jigsaw pieces, of thoughts exploring death. So when she says too imperceptible at last to seem like perfidy, this means deception or like lies. So it's almost like she's not blaming Summer for leaving because it's so imperceptible, it was barely noticed. So the next 4 lines then. A quietness distilled as twilight long begun, of nature spending with herself, sequestered afternoon. So we're going to look here at distilled and long begun. Now remember, all the way through she's still talking about grief. So she's describing grief as something that is distilled. So what she's meaning here likely is that grief is something that is a very intense, very strong emotion. But the fact that it's long begun means that grief lasts a long time. What we also have is this idea of twilight. Now twilight is, you know, afternoon to evening. So we have more ideas here about the passing of time, and again, day into night equaling, you know, life into death, essentially, with the day equaling life and the night equaling death here. You could also view this as either hopeful or very negative and pessimistic. It could be hopeful that really what we're looking here is change. Again, think about these themes: change and transformation. It could be grief will change, it will go, or it could be grief, you know, will come again. So depending on your reading of the poem, when she's looking at this idea of change and transformation, you know, like life changing into death or day turning into night, grief will change. Everything is cycles. It's a poem about circles here. You know, and nothing stays the same. That is the one guarantee in life. Nothing is permanent. Nothing stays the same. These are the big philosophical ideas that she's exploring here, because the nature of life is to die. As depressing as that sounds, that is the one thing we can all be sure of. None of us are immortal. So there's almost this inevitability here about things coming in cycles. So depending on whether you want to view this positively or negatively, she's saying, you know, you may be feeling grief now, but that will transform into something different because nothing stays the same. Or you could view it as, you may feel grief now and you may get over it, but inevitably someone else close to you will die and you will just feel grief again. So these next lines are really significant: of nature spending with herself, sequestered afternoon. Now what she's doing here is she has personified nature as a woman, and we see that a lot. We see it in Two Autumn, for example. We see England personified as a woman in The Soldier, for example. So, you know, it's not unusual. Links back to this whole pagan idea really of the goddess, really, and Earth being this sort of nature goddess. So thinking about the word sequestered, if something is sequestered, then it is kept away from everything else. So what you could also link in here is it's personifying nature as a woman, but it's also reflecting herself and her own emotions, because we know she is someone who kept herself sequestered away from others. What's also interesting as well is if you take quietness and sequestered. So I'm running out of space here, so I'm going to do a little star and I'm going to put it up here. Okay, so if you take quietness and you take sequestered, these are very peaceful, very calming. So you can't see that. These are very peaceful or calming words. So, you know, grief brings peace and reflection. So it's almost hopeful, which again, if you're looking for alternative readings and interpretations of this poem and you're focusing on things being quite negative, that can be quite an interesting point to make, because actually for a moment here she's almost saying grief is something normal. Grief is just a spectrum of on the sort of emotional scale. There's so many different emotions, and actually there can be something very peaceful, something very calming about grief, because it really is making you reflect on the meaning and the cycle of life, because death is part of the natural order of the world. So let's look at the next 4 lines then. The dusk drew earlier in, the morning foreign shone, a courteous yet harrowing grace, as guest that would be gone. So the dusk drew earlier in. What we have here is more imagery of the passing of time. And again, dusk is the same as twilight, really. So the passing of time, again, this idea of grief and death are inevitable. You know, we can't escape. Part of life is experience these things and accepting that they are going to happen to us. You know, it's all about, again, all about cycles, passing of time, change and transformation. Okay, so the morning foreign shone. Now, when we think of the morning, I'm going to make this one go all the way down here so I've got some space. When we think of the morning, we think of positive things, you know, new day, fresh starts, you know, happiness. But these things are foreign. So she's saying any feeling other than grief feels, you know, unusual. She's not used to feeling anything. And again, unfortunately, when you're going through something quite difficult, when you first wake up, sometimes your mind can just completely forget about it. And then you remember, and then it can feel sort of like all of that hitting you. So she's really talking about that moment in the grieving process where you wake up and things seem okay, but that feels really foreign, that feels really unusual, because grief has become such a huge part of your life that you almost get to the point where you don't know how to feel without it. It just becomes your norm. And this links into a courteous yet harrowing grace. Now, if something's harrowing, then it's, you know, difficult. And again, she's saying, you know, change can be distressing. You know, change can be distressing to deal with. So actually you may think, well, feeling a little bit better when you're grieving is a good thing, but actually it can feel very harrowing, it can feel very difficult, because it can not feel right that actually you're suddenly feeling a bit better, and then that comes that guilt as well, as if you're forgetting that person that has passed just because you're feeling a little bit more positive one day. So this idea that it's a foreign emotion, happiness is a foreign emotion, and that it can feel very harrowing, it can feel very guilty, is the sort of concept that she's wanting us to think about here. So what she's doing here as guest that would be gone is she's personify time. And again, it's this repetition of this idea that the passing of time is, sorry, I can't write, inevitable, as is, you know, the passing of grief. So you could again view this as a more positive idea, that actually, just like you're going to wake up one morning and your grief will be lessened, it's as inevitable as the passing of time, because again, you can't stay in that grieving process forever. And she may be saying it's inevitable that you will be back there one day, but she's saying it's also inevitable that that process will lessen, that your pain will lessen, because again, everything is about a cycle, and you will cycle on from your grief. And at some point, at one morning soon, you will wake up and your grief will inevitably feel like less of a burden than it did the day before. And that can be difficult to deal with, harrowing, but it's as inevitable as the passing of time. And that's just life. That's the natural order of things. Because ultimately, time, you could view that as nature, is more powerful than man, which again is a very common concept in a lot of these poems. Think of Hawk Roosting, think of Ozymandias, this idea of nature being more powerful than man, and you know, the natural world as being more powerful than man is something Emily Dickinson is doing here as well. So in the final 4 lines we have, and thus without a wing or service of a keel, our summer made her light escape into the beautiful. So with this phrase, and thus, and again I'm gonna sort of go down to give myself some room, although I need to point this down so you can see it. It's sort of signalling a change in mood or tone. It's becoming more logical, or arguably more positive here. It's almost this idea that, you know, they're ready to move on from their grief, which is really important, because again, that is normal and that is part of how things should be. So we now have without a wing or service of a keel. Now wing and keel, wing is obviously the wing of a bird, keel is part of a boat. These are words linked with movement, or almost tools, but it's without a wing or service of a keel. So what she's actually saying here is grief will pass naturally, as it is normal due to the passing of time. You know, you don't need any assistance, you don't need any tools. Grief will pass with time. Just like summer going into autumn is normal and natural, so is the end of the grieving process. So here we have are, which is important, because what we have here is a plural possessive pronoun. So what she's saying here is grief will happen to us all. it's, you know, part of the human experience, and again is normal and is natural. We have here as well with the adjective light, our summer made her light escape. So again, oh my goodness, I can't believe how much space I'm running out of. So her light escape, you know, again, it's easy to eventually escape your grief because it's natural. That's what she's saying here. I'm sorry that this has got really, really complicated in actually having to look at it. Who would have thought for such a small poem we would find so much to write about? And then the poem ends with this positivity. So our summer made her light escape into the beautiful. So we have again this sort of idea of, you know, ending with a positive, you know, the end of grief should be celebrated. It should be something that, you know, we're happy. You could view beautiful as almost, you know, her escape into the beautiful, almost this escape into the afterlife or into heaven. You know, that actually, you know, the end of grief is something that should be celebrated. So then we have this full stop. Okay, oh my goodness, I really am running out of arrows. I'm sorry, I hope you can all decipher this at home. So the full stop can equal, you know, the end slash, you know, acceptance. A little bit so you can see it. Almost the end or the acceptance of grief being over. And we can see that that's the first full stop of the whole poem, other than these dashes. And if you look here, the last 4 lines show that there are no dashes. We can see here, this area, they're the most concentrated, which could argue her thoughts are the most fragmented, sort of mentally tormented here. But by the end of the poem, the lack of the dashes could symbolise, again, this acceptance. So we're just going to add that to here. So, you know, the lack of dashes in the last 4 lines could symbolise the fact she is now at peace and no longer tormented. So that was, for a small poem, that was a right old mammoth of an annotation. So well done if you have kept up with this. And actually, whilst it is a tricky poem because of the ideas that it's getting us to think about, once you understand that she's using summer, summer turning into autumn to represent the passing of time, to represent change and transformation, to symbolise that process of grief, that grief will one day end, it does become more straightforward to write about. Okay, well done. So, I'm just going to go through with you one written task that I would like you to do after this analysis. So, if I were you, I would finish this lesson today. You've annotated the poem now, and you know you would have been doing that for a chunk of time. But then decide today on which of these writing tasks you're going to do, and then actually do these writing tasks later on in the week. Obviously, if you want to do it back to back, that's completely your choice. So what I'd like you to do to complete at some point this week is to pick one of these tasks. So you could either write an analysis of how Dickinson presents the passing of time in As Imperceptibly as Grief. So doing that sort of 20-minute practice. So try and write 4 mini PEs if you can. Write a comparative mini PE comparing how the passing of time is presented in afternoons and how the passing of time is presented in As Imperceptibly as Grief. So just that one comparative mini PE. And again, in past videos, we've gone through how to do that. Write a summary, sorry, there's a typo there, it should be an A. Write a summary of the similarities and differences between afternoons and As Imperceptibly as Grief. So if the first two sound a little bit daunting or difficult to do independently, you might just want to summarise some of the things that are the same and some of the things that are different about afternoons and As Imperceptibly as Grief. Or if you'd rather do something creative, you might want to write your own poem where you are reflecting on, again, the passing of time. And if you want to use the seasons to do that, like afternoons, like As Imperceptibly as Grief, and like To Autumn, absolutely. Or if you want to use something else as your sort of metaphor or symbolism for the passing of time. But I know there are a few of you that have been enjoying these creative tasks, so I thought I'd put one there. Okay, so decide on which you're going to do, and you can pause the video and get that written down, either to do today or to do at some point later on in the week. And remember to email your class teacher any written work that you've done so we can give you some feedback. Okay, finally then, do you think Dickinson feels disillusioned by the end of summer in the poem? And why do you think Dickinson presents grief as an imperceptible emotion? It's just 2 final questions there just to really explore the 2 pieces of vocabulary. Well done, guys. You have completed your anthology. And if you have been doing all of these videos, all of these poetry videos, massive, massive well done. And I promise you, when we return back to school in September, you will be really, really glad that you have done them. Okay, well done.